In 1867, soldiers on the Bozeman Trail would receive this new weapon, the 1866 Springfield Trapdoor conversion. Chambered in 5070, this was the second model of the conversion, first one being a 58 rimfire. These guns would be put into a baptism of fire, wagon box fight, and hayfield fights on August 1st and 2nd of 1867. The small change of innovation meant the difference between life and death for the soldiers in both locations.
Fill her up. Fill up your keppies and forage your caps, boys. Let's go.
Away from Mississippi's Vale, with my old hat there for sale, I crossed upon the cotton bale to my Rose of Alabama. Oh, brown Rosie, she's a Rose of Alabama. A sweet tobacco mosey is my Rose of Alabama. I landed on the far sandbank, I sat upon a hollow plank, and there I made the banjo twang for my Rose of Alabama. Oh, brown Rosie, she's a Rose of Alabama. Sweet tobacco mosey is my Rose of Alabama. Said, sit down just where you please. She crossed my legs, she took her ease. It's good to go down on the knees, says Rose of Alabama. Oh, brown Rosie, she's a Rose of Alabama. Sweet tobacco mosey is my Rose of Alabama. The river rolled, the crickets sing, the lightning bug he flashed his wing. Like a rope, my arms I fling round Rose of Alabama. Oh, brown Rosie, she's a Rose of Alabama. Sweet tobacco mosey is my Rose of Alabama. I huff so long I cannot tell, but Rosie seemed to like it well, and my banjo in the river fell. Oh, Rose of Alabama. Oh, brown Rosie, she's a Rose of Alabama. Sweet tobacco mosey is my Rose of Alabama.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to the history of the Springfield Trapdoor Rifle, Episode 2, the second Allin conversion, otherwise lovingly known as the Springfield Model of 1866. Now, if you were here last time, you know that we talked about the model of 1865. Now, that was a prototype weapon that they made about 5,000 of, and it never really saw service in any extent whatsoever. In a large 58 rimfire cartridge, which was obviously a very heavy 500 grain bullet, and it was powered by 60 grains of 2F black powder. And if you want to see that, go back and check that out. Well, it is time to talk about the model of 1866, which I have here in front of me. I have two models here, and we are going to talk about both of them in this video. However, this one will come much later, as this is kind of a civilian gun. This is the real deal right here. The real model 1866, and a very early one at that. Just so you know, there is a complete reading list in the description of this video in video format. But for today, we're going to deal with mostly two books, although the other books are involved. If you really want to know about the 1866, I suggest 4570 Springfield, Book 2, 1865 through 1893. This is by Al Frasca. The other book that's really good for if you're just going out to buy one, and a limited definition with all sizes and makes and models and changes, is the 58 and 50 caliber rifles and carbines of the Springfield Armory, 1865 through 1872 by Richard A. Halmsmere. This is a must-have book if you are looking for a complete original piece that has not been molested or changed in any way, because this will give you exact dimensions of everything you need to know to make sure nobody's fooled with the trapdoor you're planning on buying and spending a lot of money on. So without further ado, let's get down to the episode. Alright, so this is our Model 1865 that we talked about last time, and if you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to go back and check that video out, as it lays the foundation for everything that's going to come again. So just a quick little recap. What do we have? They have the 1861 base rifle that will never be used again as a trapdoor after the 1865. But you can see we have these wide barrel bands. We also have a very different system, and if you want to see an in-depth version of it, go back and watch that video like I said. Now this gun shoots this fat little 58 caliber rimfire cartridge, and the system works completely different from the system we're going to talk about today, or any other trapdoor system you will ever see. This gun was not successful. This gun had a lot of issues, and only a little over 5,000 of these were ever made, and they were really only trial guns. But as you can see here, you can obviously tell the difference, this big flat thumb piece. There's several other differences we could talk about, but go back and watch the other video if you want to know the in-depth history of the 1865. Now, let's take this off the table and get back to talking about what we want to talk about, which is the model of 1866. So now we're dealing with just the rifle we're going to be talking about here for quite a while. And as I said, the backstory is already built in the previous episode. So now that we have done away with that shortened model, and we will get back to that, I promise, let's talk about the standard military issue gun, what it is, what it was, how good was it, and was it very effective. Erskine S. Allen, our workshop hero, as I've called him before, definitely understood that there was some issues with the model of 1865, and actually had a prototype plan already in the work in the beginning of 1866. And in March of 1866, he took a prototype to T. Laidley, who was of course in charge of the Laidley board, and told him, this is what we need to be looking at. This is a far better action. I've had a little more time to study it, and this is what we need to work with. Laidley took a look at the gun, and on April the 2nd of 1866, he wrote to Allen, "Sir, you will proceed without delay to Washington City, taking with you your latest improved musket, and report to the Chief of Ordnance the nature of the improvements, and such other information as may be desired in relation of your plan to make or alter muskets." Now this first musket conversion that he brought to the board, the Laidley board in Washington in 1866, was not like what we think of a model of 1866 today. It is in the Springfield Museum, and it actually has a number marked on it of 5,795. And it is not exactly what we think of when we think of this musket, as I said before. For one, it is in 50-70, but it's in 50-70 rimfire, something totally off the wall that would never actually take off, to the best of my knowledge, unless it did in the civilian market somewhere, but definitely not militarily. Also, it had a 36-inch barrel. Now, as you'll recall, these original Civil War muskets have a barrel of 40 inches, and so that first cut-down gun was way ahead of its time. As you'll see later, Allen already had in mind the 1873. He just didn't quite know how to get there yet. This is the model of 1866, and as I said, it comes out early with this prototype, early in 1866. As a matter of fact, the prototype is up before the first 2,000 model 1865s are out and going, and that's going to be a common theme you're going to see here for a little while in the series. Allen is usually already working on a better prototype by the time the government gets the orders out for the last one that he's already worked on. So the model of 1865 is going out. He's got this. The board actually kind of likes it. And by July the 28th of 1866, they will order 25,000 of these things with a few minor changes. Let me read you a letter. This is a letter by Major General A.B. Dreyer, who was at this point already been made the Chief of Ordnance, and he is writing to Colonel J.G. Benton, who is the Commandant of the Springfield Armory at the time. This letter is stamped July 28th of 1866. And Dreyer writes, "Sir, the Secretary of War, having directed the conversion of 25,000 Springfield rifle muskets into breech-loaders and the preparation of an adequate supply of ammunition for them, you will take immediate measures to carry the order into effect. The plan of alteration will be that of Mr. Allen, with such modifications of the original plan as recent trials of the arms may have suggested. The caliber will be 50 of an inch, the reduction to be made by inserting a steel or iron tube into the barrel as suggested by Colonel Lately in his letter to this office on the 29th of March, 1866. As many of the parts of the muzzle-loading arm as can be used will be retained. The ramrod should be held in its place in the stock by means of a female screw. It is observed that the 50 caliber musket sent to this office from the Springfield Armory allows the cartridge to be exploded when the breech piece is not in place and locked. This is a serious defect which should be corrected, and without cutting away enough of the stock above the lock plate to allow moisture to get into the lockwork. The proper method of rifling will be determined by you. You will please prepare and send to this office an examination and approval 2 models of a new converted arm. The ammunition will be made at the Frankfort Arsenal, but you are charged with determining the proper charge of powder and weight and form of ball and preparing model cartridges. A detailed account of the lubricant will be furnished for this office. A center prime cartridge is preferred to the rim primed, if one suitable for military service and equally sure fire can be devised. You will direct your attention particularly to getting a proper cartridge, but the conversion of the arms will not be delayed in order that you may determine whether the center fire cartridges may be adopted. Half of these arms will be varnished stocks. Each issue will be of equal numbers of varnished and unvarnished stocks. You will please inform the Bureau how soon and at what rate you will be able to prepare these arms. Major General A.B. Dreyer, Chief of Ordnance." All right, so let's deal with the elephant in the room first of that prototype. Now, the problem with that prototype was when the door was opened or closed, it could set off that rimfire 5070 cartridge. And the reason it could do that was it had a small lip up here that would catch the cartridge and insert it, and it would set off that rimfire cartridge. Allen immediately fixed this by moving that little lip down to the center where it would be hitting the center of the cartridge. And he wrote back and told them he had fixed it. By then it was a moot point because they were not going to use the rimfire ammo. Now, as you'll recall, on the 1865, we were using this very fat, short 58 caliber rimfire cartridge, which shot originally what was basically the Burton bullet that they had been using during the Civil War. Big 500 grain bullet propelled by 60 grains of powder. But why did we get away from that? Well, for one thing, rimfire was an issue. The military had already found extreme issues with shipping ammunition for either Henry's or Spencer carbines or Spencer rifles, that the ammunition that was rimfire had almost rendered these guns unusable to the military. You'll notice on a lot of the Spencers that there's only one firing pin, but on the Henrys, they actually put 2 firing pins because the ammunition was unreliable. It tended to not go off when you wanted it to, but it tended to go off when you didn't want it to. There were 2 cases of wagons taking cartridges to the military out west of the Mississippi River on bumpy roads that when they would hit a bump, they would tend to start losing cartridges. And as a matter of fact, it became such an issue that the government decided we need to do some serious tests to see if rimfire is the way to go. One of the reasons they're not going to adopt the 1860 Henry is it's a rimfire gun. Not in any massive numbers anyway. It really, really limited both it and the Spencer. So in 1866, a board known as the Hancock Board was brought about to work with Allen in the selection of a new cartridge for the United States military. The little 58 rimfire would definitely be short-lived, not even really being out for a year before it was already beginning to be replaced. Now, the only problem is when this Hancock Board was formed in early 1866, January as a matter of fact, All they had to work with were the early 1865 muskets. And as you'll recall, if you looked into that thing with that carriage extractor and the pop-up ejector and all that craziness that was going on inside that gun, it required an actually very short cartridge. So, what was the problem? Well, we started out with our little 58 rimfire, and we had the choice of either this 4570, which this one's a 500 grain. They would have been testing with a 405 grain bullet, but this one has a pointed 500 grain, or this 5070. The trouble was, although the 4570 actually worked better at distance, there was not that much of an accuracy difference out to 350 yards between it and the 5070. After about 350 yards, the 5070 began to fall off rapidly. But would they ever really need to reach much farther than that, especially with new sights that they could lift that would have adjustments for every yardage you needed, even with the rainbow trajectory of the 5070? No. The main issue was that old 1865 model just couldn't handle that long cartridge. And nobody at the time knew yet that Allin was going to be able to produce something like this that would be able to handle a longer cartridge. And so it was decided by Grant and several others that even though Allin preferred the 4570 all the way back in 1866, Grant thought that it would cost too much to modify the guns that were there at the time to take it. And also, we can just probably admit there was probably a little bit of a bias towards the bigger, heavier round at the time. And so, the 5070 would be selected over the 4570 in 1866 for the model of 1866 rifle. Now, the next question. What are we going to do with this? Is it going to be rimfire or is it going to be centerfire? Now, as I've already discussed, rimfire was on its way out and many people knew it. However, they had to prove to Congress and the Ordnance Board and everybody else that the centerfire cartridge was superior. So on August 10th of 1866, by the way, we are still in production of that model 1865 rifle. Productions really just begin to ramp up. C.C. Chaffee would conduct tests. On August 10th, Captain Chaffee placed 50 centerfire cartridges in a tumbler and tumbled for 20 consecutive hours. Not one centerfire discharged. On November 23rd of 1866, he placed 42 rimfire cartridges in the same tumbler and 28 discharged within 13 hours. The United States military was officially done with rimfire cartridges. So one of the other reasons that Grant gave for going with the 50 caliber cartridge instead of the 45 that most people overlook, and I had to dig into just a little bit, was he said we should go with the 50 caliber because the United States had already adopted a 50 caliber cartridge. And honestly, I had to stop and think about that for a minute because I don't think in cavalry terms. I always forget that the model of 1865 Spencer was out there. Now this is a cartridge gun. Its main drawback is it's in rimfire, and the action can be a little fiddly to work, but it has a 7-shot in the buttstock tube magazine, and it is a lever action. The way this gun works is a little more finicky than a lot. You put it on half cock, you open the lever, and it will feed a cartridge, and you close it, go to full cock, and fire. Now, a lot of people will argue that the United States Cavalry should have stayed with this right here, even over the Henry, because the Henry rifle, which was known for its not very powerful 44 caliber Henry rimfire, which was somewhere below 30 grains of powder, this gun right here could be chambered anywhere from a 56 caliber, which it originally was during the Civil War, but after the Civil War in 1865, they neck it down to a 50 caliber known as the 5650. This is the reason we have that 50 caliber cartridge known as the 5070 today. One of Grant's main selling points was we've already adopted this. We already know how to use these bullets in this bore. We know the rifling that they need. So why don't we go ahead and just keep everything the same and go with 50? So yes, you guys who believe that the Spencer is superior, I'm not going to argue with you, but the reason the Trapdoor in 5070 exists is because of this Spencer repeating rifle or carbine. So there were a few tests with those Spencers to see what would happen if they put a rounded bullet into a centerfire Spencer in that tube magazine and see what happened, because the military was not using flat-nosed bullets at the time. Almost universally, they would use round-nosed bullets because of the way that their swaging worked. They didn't cast bullets like we do today when we make this ammo. They swaged them, and usually when swaging, you get only one flat surface. In this case, you want that to be the back of the bullet and not the front. And so you have a rounded-nosed bullet. There were ways they could have obviously gone to a flat-nosed bullet, but that was not something that they had in mind to do. And so they did test some actual round-nosed bullets in a center fire in the Spencer carbine. Now, round-nosed bullets don't bother the Spencer carbine in rimfire because the nose of the bullet in the magazine is hitting the center of the gun, not the rim. However, when you change to center fire, you have an issue because the center of that round bullet is pressing up against the actual primer of the next bullet in front of it. And so they decided to take a Spencer and drop it from 12 feet onto a timber floor, but first load it and see if they get any discharges. Now, as far as I know, they didn't actually get any discharges in that particular test, but in the report that was written, they did mention that other people outside of their test who had tried it had gotten detonations, and other people today still can get detonations by dropping round-nosed bullets in a tube magazine and getting them to jostle against each other and go off. I believe it was a Henry rifle that Ian McCollum tried that on in one of his videos over on Forgotten Weapons, and actually had a detonation, and he had to actually go to the emergency room. So yeah, it was not a safe thing to put round-nosed bullets into that Spencer. And so if we're going to keep the Spencer, which we will for a few years, but if we're going to keep it indefinitely, it's got to go to center fire, and we'll have to change the nose of the bullet. They really didn't want to do all that. So for now, the Spencer would stay in the military so long as we had a supply of rimfire ammo to keep up with it. But I believe at this point they were already deciding we're going to get a new single shot rifle for the cavalry, because these things, that rimfire ammo is going to run out, and when it does, we're pretty well done with it. They already had it written off, I believe, but they were still interested in keeping that 50 caliber cartridge. As you can tell, there was not a huge rush though to get these out, even though we had already sent in our first prototypes really all the way back in March and April of 1866. Not a whole lot is heard about until late July of 1866, and I have a theory on that. This is not anything I can prove, but it's what I think. Colonel Henry B. Carrington had been sent out to the Bozeman Trail in the west up in Montana and Wyoming, and his job was, at the time, protect the Bozeman Trail from attack from natives. One such native would have been War Chief Red Cloud. Now, when Carrington gets there, and I'm not going to go into deep detail on this, if you want to know more about this, go check out Duke Fraser Productions' Tales of the Trails podcast, where he covers Red Cloud's War. He's working his way through it right now, and it's kind of in association with us here on 11 Bang Bang, so go check that out if you want the in-depth history. But Carrington shows up in the west out on the Bozeman Trail and realizes the natives are not, in his opinion, necessarily better armed than the United States military out on the Bozeman Trail, as most natives in 1866 and 65 and 67 are going to be armed with, for the most part, muzzle-loaded Lehman rifles. The model 1866 Winchester isn't there yet. Henry's, they'd only made about 14,000 of those up to this point, and yes, they were out in the West, but a lot of those were in the hands of civilians and whites and people on what Carrington considered his side. However, they were matched, he felt, in the muzzle-loading musketry that was going on from both sides. The Indians could have had older Enfield muskets as well, but a lot of them had bows and arrows. What really worried him was the fact that his units were outnumbered 10, 15, even 20 to 1 sometimes, and him, knowing that Springfield had been working on the model of 1865 breech-loaded musket, began to push extremely hard for the United States military to get him breech-loading muskets, new muskets, out to the west. And I believe these letters were heard and heeded by the Ordnance Department, as July 28th, you saw that there was a rush put on to put these things out. Now, the trouble was there would have to be some machining changes to produce these. And there's a couple of things that's going to happen here. First of all, we've already decided that we're going with a centerfire 50 caliber cartridge with 70 grains of powder behind it. It's going to be lubed with bayberry wax, and it is going to be a very, very viable cartridge. But, as you'll recall, we are dealing with Civil War muskets. And in this case of the 1866s, we're no longer dealing with that old 1861 model that we were using to make the 1865. And the new model of 1866 would be made with the latest guns that were made in Springfield that had almost to a T never been issued. As far as I know, these are all new parts, even though they're from older Civil War muskets. They would go with the model of 1864. Now, the interesting thing is some of the lock plates can say 1866. There's no real rule about that. Hard and fast is when that came. But most of the time, the lock plates are going to be marked 1864. And as you'll remember in our last episode, you know in 1864 because you have the barrel retention springs back, but you don't have the big, heavy, thick 1861 style barrel bands on there anymore. They're the narrow ones. They still have a screw retention here in the center, but they do have those barrel band springs back in place to hold them in place. So, brand new muskets sitting in there, never been used for the majority of them, so they're not technically converted battlefield Civil War muskets. They're going to use the best parts that they can find for muskets that have never been issued. As you'll recall, they had well over 1 million muskets sitting in storage, so they had their pick of the litter, shall we say. They're not going to use something that's been used up on the battlefield, brought in, repaired, has patches or different parts changed into it, and then turn it into one of these. No, they're going to use the best muskets they have at this point because we're past the test stage of the model of 1865. We know we're going to do this. Let's use the best guns we have. Alright, so the first thing we have to do is work out how to get this thing from 58 down to 50. And it would be explained by Allin how it was done, but Allin would freely admit this was not his baby. This was not something he discovered. This was the product of a man who worked down in the Springfield water shops. He was the head of forging and finishing, and his name was Charles Bailey. And he came up with this brilliant idea. We're going to bore these barrels out and insert, in a rather strange way, a 50 caliber barrel liner. So that if any of these guns had got erosion or anything while they were sitting in storage, no need to even worry about it anymore. We're not using that old bore. We're going with something completely new. So when questioned by the Ordnance Board how they would do this in December of 1866, Allin brought Bailey's plan to light and explained to the Ordnance Board exactly how it would work in a letter. The rifling is bored out and the barrel bored to the right size for receiving a new bushing, requiring 3 operations. Then it is counterbored 5 1/2 inches in the breech in to form a shoulder, which is .007 deep. The bushing, having been turned, etc., as described below, is then put in, driven up to the shoulder, where they are braced together at the muzzle, and then proofed with 2 charges, 280 grains of powder and 500 grains of lead, and 1 charge of 250 grains of powder and 500 grains of lead. Then bored twice, which brings them up to finishing size. The bushings are rolled out the same as the barrel, then sawed in 2, each part rolled out to the proper length. After being annealed, they are straightened and bored twice, the end milled off to the right length, and a ring of babbitt metal cast around the center to hold it, so it cannot spring in turning. Turning on each end up to the ring knocked off and the center turned, straightened again, turned the whole length except the shoulder, straightened and then ground to gauges, ready to put in the barrel. The cost of this operation totals $1.56. So as the year of 1866 grinds on into the fall, Erskine Allin has this thing pretty well worked out. He is ready to put them together. He only has one major issue. Ever since the war, his task force has been cut dramatically. He is working on putting out the model of 1865. There's not a lot of help to get his model of 1866 off the ground. And even though the government has ordered the 25,000, they haven't been real forthcoming with either a plan to get him more people or finances. That is until December 21st of 1866. Now, I'm not going to go into deep detail once again. Go check out the Tales of the Trails podcast if you really want to know the in-depth, every nook and cranny of the story. But December 21st of 1866, something happened that would forever change the United States military in the West. You see, Carrington had his men under him, some Fetterman, some Grumman, some people like that, who were in the process of protecting a wagon train, and let's just say that it didn't go the way they planned. Carrington had told Fetterman to leave the fort with his group of about 80 soldiers, and there were a few other groups there. There were some civilians, there was some cavalry. He said, whatever you do, do not cross that ridge up there, Lodge Trail Ridge. Well, what happened? Fetterman may have been a bit of a glory hound, and when the natives showed themselves, a handful of natives, they showed themselves, acted to attack, and then feigned back and feinted over the ridge. Well, Fetterman gave chase right over the ridge. All of his infantry and a number of cavalry followed, and some civilians. And what happened was they were met by an astounding force. What happened when Fetterman crossed the ridge that day with his measly little 81 men, he was immediately met on the other side by a force of around 1,000 native warriors. Now, some of the men there would have been armed with Spencer rifles. Some of the men there, 2 of them in particular, the civilians, would have been armed with Henry repeating rifles, but the majority of them were armed with muzzle-loading Springfield or Enfield rifles. I'm not sure exactly in this case which ones they had. But as they went over there, they were immediately wiped out. All except for the guys with the Henrys, who it appears fought for a lot longer because they had cartridge repeating firepower. And not only were they wiped out, they were completely massacred. We are talking, as Duke Frazier would say in the Tales of the Trails podcast, when they went to bury them, not one soldier was buried complete with all of his body parts. That is how brutal this massacre of these 81 men was. So, I find it very interesting, even though there's no written connection in my mind, that this happens on December 21st of 1866. Just about the amount of time that it would take word to get back to Washington, December 24th, Christmas Eve of 1866, Erskine S. Allen and the Springfield Armory go into overtime. Now, the plan had always been for Erskine Allen to get these things turned out starting in January of 1867. Just like the 65, they're going to come out the next year. The Model 1866 will come out in 1867. The Model of 1868 will come out in 1869, and so on and so forth. That's just how it works. The idea was, with the understaffed armory, he would begin turning out, with all machinery set up, 10 guns a day on January the 2nd of 1867. And then hopefully, with the government's help, he would be able to retain some of those old workers that had left after the Civil War, and he hoped that he had a staff that by the middle of 1867 could be turning out 200 of these a day. As I said, the Fetterman massacre takes place on December 21st of 1866. Just enough time for word to get back to Washington. By December 24th of 1866, Christmas Eve, Erskine Allen goes into 100% full all-hands-on-deck production mode, which is very strange. I've never seen the written order, but I strongly believe that by the time the word of the Fetterman massacre had gotten back to the government, they suddenly panicked and were in a huge hurry to get these Model 1866s out to the West, because the government always looks for someone to blame in these cases. And yes, some blame was put on Carrington, because he was the man in charge, even if he wasn't there, and even if he gave specific orders not to go into this ambush, the blame would be placed on him, and the other place the blame would go would be to the old muzzle-loaded weapons. There was not a lot of cover in that fight for the troops, and not a lot of good leadership, something that will happen again in just a few years, but we'll get to that later. So, on December 24th, he goes into working all night on Christmas Eve. December 25th, Christmas of 1866, Springfield Armory would work 2 full shifts, a 20-hour run. They had never done that. Even during the Civil War, they would take off on Christmas Day, but not in 1866. There was a rapid rehiring of people that would left the company from the Civil War, and they were brought in, and on January the 2nd of 1867, they turned out their first 200. The men had previously already been trained on how to make the guns that they were converting. They had made those guns themselves. Very little training was needed. All we had to do was get them in shape, get them made, and get them out of here. By the way, this system is very simple compared to our model of 1865. Let's at this time take a moment to get in here and look at what this gun looks like compared to our older model of 1865. Alright guys, so we have it apart here, and no, we're not going to do that on camera. I oftentimes have people ask me, why can't you take that apart on camera? Other big channels do. Other big channels are playing with fire, and believe me, knowing our channel, we will get hit if we disassemble this thing on camera for modifying a firearm or something. So we're not going to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the different parts of this gun, and as always, we're going to do lock, stock, and then talk about the barrel. So without further ado, let's get in here and let's talk about this lock. Okay, so now let's talk about these locks. Now, as a general rule, your lock will say model of 1864 back here, because these guns are made from the latest guns that Springfield had, as I said before, the model of 1864. Now, there are some exceptions to this. There have been noted some 1863 locks to exist, and the very rare model 1866. If your gun says 1866 on the lock, that means that is a brand new production lock. It's very rare. I've not seen one personally outside of one very exceptional one, and we'll get to in just a minute. But I've not seen one personally, but they do exist with the number of 1863 and very rarely the number of 1866. Now over here you will see we have our US Springfield and our Eagle, and we once again have pretty much the same hammer that we had on the 1865. It has a very far leaned in piece here. As a matter of fact, as a left-handed shooter, you sometimes have the hammer blocking your vision. And we have knurling up here that's known as the shield knurling. If your gun is correct, it will have what is called shield knurling, as this knurling on the hammer will be in the shape of a shield. Now if you look in here, we have basically everything in here is the same. Nothing has changed. We have all of our markings and everything. This is just the inside of a standard model of 1864 Springfield lock. And it always amazes me just how thick these things are. And here we have our two flat-headed slot screws for our lock screws. Just very plain screws right there. Alright, let's move on to the stock. Alright, so let's take a look at this gun here. Alright, right here we have our US stamped butt plate. And as you can see, if I turn this, I can't turn it very well, it's just your standard Civil War butt plate. Now, up here we have F stamped right above it. I'm not sure what that's for. And on this side, if the camera can pick it up, we have the number 7441. Now, that is not on every one that I've seen. I strongly have a suspicion this gun may have wound up in Europe during the Franco-Prussian War from that number and one other thing, but I can't prove it, so I'm not going to claim it, but I think this is an import number for that. Now, as we move on down the stock here, we have our model of 1864 standard trigger guard, everything. Now, here's where things get interesting. Let me turn this around. There is a cartouche on this gun, although you cannot see it. You can sometimes see it under magnified light, but it is right there. And there's just barely a circle, and in the center it is stamped HSH. And the reason it is so faint is I believe this particular gun was cleaned up and sent, like I said, possibly to Europe during the Franco-Prussian War. And there are records of them sanding them and refinishing them, but they don't sand them down like a Bannerman or something. We still have good sharp edges. And I have a feeling the reason that is so faint is it's factory refinished. And that happened to over half of them. So that is very interesting, HSH. Now, what that means is this is a brand new stock from the factory. Only one stamp. Very rarely will you encounter the ESA stamp on a model of 1866. Now, a lot of people say that's because he, at the time, was working in development already of the 1868 and other things, and he doesn't always put his stamp on there, but a lot of times you will see HSH. If this were a stock from a Civil War musket, it would have possibly up to 3 different stamps on it. If it just has HSH, that means this is a brand new stock built for this gun. Once again, it happened quite a bit, especially in early production. Now moving down, we have just our standard model of 1863 stock. I'm sorry, or 1864. Either of them work. They're both the same. You have your barrel band here, a 3 barrel band stock. with nose cap. Now, as you'll recall with that crazy action on the model of 1865, this wood where that cable and spring and eye hook and all that was always worn out. We don't have that here because we're no longer dealing with that system. What we have here, as you can see, this is our cutout for what was known as the spoon. The spoon has been removed and the rod is held in by thread, the clearing rod. But the elephant in the room is this huge round, half round inletting right here. Now you might say, why is that there? Well, because we have a brand new extractor system that we will talk about as soon as we get to the barrel. Other than that, we have a very, very clean lock mortise. It's marked W in here in a couple places. And very cleanly done. You can tell the Springfield router work when you see it. It's some of the cleanest mortise work you will see on these muskets. Without further ado, let's get to the barrel and the action. And once again, we have our barrel bands. We have 3 because these should be 3-band rifles with 40-inch long barrels. The bands once again say U. That means this side up. This is our middle barrel band that is held with the screw in the sling swivel, and once again U. And then our very end barrel band, once again U. 3 very basic barrel bands. Alright, so we're going to move on to the muzzle of the barrel, and as you can see, we are sleeved here. And if you look very closely, you can still see the seam where that insert is in there. Here we have our standard model of 1864 infantry sight. Now let's move on down here. Well, the first thing we can talk about here is instead of that crazy long spring and carriage action that we had going on in the model of 1865, we now have one large spring that sticks down into the stock, and this is called a horseshoe spring. Now the way it works is it was milled out of the exact same piece of barrel here. This piece was milled out, and then they would fit this spring in here, and that is your extractor spring. On that model of 1865 and the previous Civil War guns, this sight that flips up and is marked for 300-yard peep sight, 500-yard peep sight, and 700-yard peep sight, or when it's down, 100. This thing is backwards. They turned it around because they felt that the recoil impulse would always knock these down forward. So they reversed them, and on the model of 1866, they're backwards. And so they won't, when the recoil goes off, the gun itself will kick, and it will actually kick it up into the stop. Now this action works a little bit like the model of 1865 in that we have 2 screws holding the door or the block on, but not a whole lot going on in here compared to that last one. Now, whereas in the model of 1865, where you heard all those spring noises and things moving in a very complicated action, when you open this door, nothing, not a single sound. That is because it only springs into action, we shall say, when you have a cartridge in there. Something interesting on this particular gun, you see that hole down in the tray? That is not common. That only occurs in the first 500 guns, to the best of my knowledge, that were made, because they were made with leftover 1865 barrels. And if you watched our video on the 1865, you will know that that little area in there is where the ejector would have sprung up to kick that rimfire cartridge out. Not the case here. Alright, so right here we have a very small nubbin that moves with the door, and what that does is it grabs the rim of the shell. Alright, so right here is the inside of that horseshoe spring, and the way that it works is when the extractor here lifts that shell out of the chamber, it will hit that horseshoe spring, which will eject it. The shell will come flying back, hit this ejector, which is simply a nub right here, and lift itself out of the barrel. Let's give it a try. Alright, I have in my hand here a dummy cartridge. Let's insert it and see how it works. Now the one thing is, you do have to throw it in there. You will close the door. Now, let's see if that horseshoe spring and everything works to get that cartridge out if you open it right. Just like that. And, whereas the 1865 only works seldomly, this one works pretty much every single time. It is a far better system. However, not the best. Also here on the bottom we have the shell stop. And the way that works is it holds the spring into position until it is ready to spring. Now I've put the dummy round in. We'll close it, and you can watch how everything works down here. This will move up, and when it hits a certain point, the spring will spring back and kick our cartridge, just like that. Okay, so let's take a look at the breech block or the trap door. Now on the model of 66, they will say 1866 with an eagle on it right there. So there are basically 3 different models. Well, I consider them 2 different variations and 1 third very rare variation. So this is the very first variation. And what you're going to see here is the thumb latch. We have the way this works is you push up, obviously, and that will disengage from a flat on the bottom of the barrel. So we have a regular screw and it runs through here and it's spring loaded, and over here on the first 7,000 guns you will see a screw head over here. If you see that screw head, that means this is one of the very first 7,000 and has a very good chance of being a Western Indian Wars early gun. This is known as the first 2-piece latch. Now, a change would come around serial number 7,000, as we've discussed, which would make this a 1-piece latch, which the way that works is there would be a screw-on plate right here, which I can't show you. It'll be in a picture here in a minute. And it would all be 1 piece, and you didn't have to unscrew that screw to take it out. And so, like I said, first 7,000 guns, slotted screw here. After that, not a slotted screw. Now the third variation would be the inside of this gun, where I can't get apart to show you. Where the spring is up here on the top, there would be a dimple for the spring to set in, and the previous 2 would just be a square piece. One other difference between the post 7,000 number and the earliest 7,000 will be there is a sharper angle on this comb right here, and I'll show you that in a couple pictures. That is technically the 3 variations, with that small divot coming along September 24th of 1867. Just remember, if you have the screw, that is a first variation. That is pre-April of 1867. And then if you have one without the screw and a flat paddle in there, that is going to be anywhere from April of 1867 to September. And any one that is flat here and has the divot in the paddle, that's going to be your third variation, and it's going to be everything made after September 24th of 1867. Let's talk about this ramrod before we're done. In all transparency, let's remember that this gun came 100% original, but it did not come with the original clearing rod. And so we had to order this one as a replica from Dixie Gun Works for it. And so it does have one major issue, but let's talk about what this one looks like compared to our old one. As you'll remember, on our 1865 and the previous muskets, this was just a cup right up here that went straight down. Now, this is not a ramrod any longer, this is a clearing rod. And so what you will find is a slot cut for a cleaning patch, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ridges on the end. Now, this is where our Dixie Gun Works replica wasn't quite correct. This should still be cupped in here, but as you can see when we ordered this one, it was just flat. But we will forgive that for now. That is for clearing jams out of the gun. We'll go down to this end. As you'll recall, they said it needs to be started with a small thread. And that's what we have right there. So that is our cleaning rod. So let's talk about the primers. These original 5070 cartridges, like this one right here that I actually picked up while hiking one day, doesn't look like it is actually a center fire. It looks like a rim fire. That's because the original center fire cartridges had the primer inside the center, whereas a modern 5070 cartridge here, you can see the primer outside where it's reloadable. These were not reloadable early on and wouldn't be for several years. These are also made with a copper alloy known as the Bloomfield gilded metal. I did find this one on the trail one day and I picked it up and kind of spread it back out. That is a very old 5070 case. Erskine S. Allen knew that that large horseshoe spring in there was not a very good way to eject cartridges, even though it was far better than the 1865. And by the year of 1869, reports were coming in that one of the major failings was, even though screwed into the wood back here, after 3 or 4 shots, the ramrod would jar loose, and it would come out the end of the gun, as you will see out on the range, I'm sure. Another thing that was noted was that the ammo was getting a little older and a little more corroded, and was sticking in the chambers, and the springs, these horseshoe springs, were breaking because they're so long, and Also, another thing was a weakness in the area of the stock. So some other things would have to be changed into the model of 1868. And these would kind of go by the wayside, obviously. But the manual itself would tell the soldiers that were still using these, the spring is a luxury and not a necessity. And as you will see when I take this gun out to shoot it, this gun is definitely, it can still be ran even without the ejector spring in it. All right, so one of the last points I always seem to forget to talk about is one of the reasons this conversion was so cheap. We can still use the old model of 1855 bayonet, and guess what? She slips right on there just like she's supposed to. Now we have a very formidable weapon.
At ease, at ease. All right, boys, we got us a new rifle here. This is our new 1866 Trapdoor rifle. Now, if you didn't remember, we had that 1865, and it was a little bit, little odd, shall we say. We had some weird ejector system up here, and you couldn't see your rear sight, and all that should be fixed. So, all right, now we are going to demonstrate on how to load this rifle. Load and for load. Here we go. Gonna go ahead and we're gonna open breech. Handle cartridge. Load cartridge. Close breech. Ready, aim, fire. Like such. And to whenever you go to unload it, remember, gentlemen, the ejector spring in this is a luxury, not a necessity. Oh, right under him. One more round. Impact. Tick. We got it.
So old Bill Cody, the scout out here on the Kansas Plains, got his hands on one of these and said he killed buffalo pretty good. Unfortunately, we ain't got any buffalo here. If I was to shoot one of them Black Angus buffaloes that's up on the hill, I think I'd be in a little bit of trouble. So I'll just stick to this gong that's out here. We'll see how this thing does. Now, I know I don't have my hearing protection in this video. That's all right. I'm already deaf. It don't make any difference. You can see why Bill Cody liked this for killing buffalo. It's a hard hitting round, but it ain't got a lot of hard recoil to it. So, wonderful little gun here. And I think this is now the oldest gun, original, that I have fired.
So what are my final thoughts on this here fine rifle? Definitely an improvement over the 1865. You saw we had issues like none other with that action on that 1865. Just wanting to, it kept on sucking the cartridge back in and everything else, kept on having to use the clearing rod. And this rifle, we have not had to do that once with. It is ran perfectly flawlessly. It's extremely accurate. If I miss, it's 100% on me. It feels very, very nice in the hand. And this is Ethan talking to you here whenever I say that I love the feel of this, because it really does feel like an old French musket. And I love that feeling. So yes, it is a very fine shooting rifle. Downfalls are probably going to be the We talked about the rainbow trajectory. That'll get addressed eventually, but I mean, still, if you know where to hold, you can kind of hit with it. And one thing I'm noticing with this rifle, and I don't think it's a downfall, but it is something to be aware of when you're shooting one of these. And then you close this breech, you'll notice that it doesn't drop that all the way down. You have to physically go and take and push that down past the hammer, and then you're ready to fire. For people talking about firing out a battery, it will not actually fire out of the battery. You can see it actually closed up the action right there. So just food for thought. Let's shoot this one more time. I think I like shooting this rifle. And let's see if I can miss. Yep, sure can. Anyhow, back to you, Garrett.
So, with the Springfield Armory putting out over 200 of these rifles every day starting in January of 1867, on March the 2nd, the first shipment of 3,000 rifles reached Omaha, Nebraska. And the way it worked was that was the shipping hub of the area. They would from there be sent out on wagons to the different forts and locations that were the hottest and deemed the most necessary in the West, aka starting with places like the Bozeman Trail. Now, on March the 10th, another 700 would wind up in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. After that, they would actually start arming the East again. The first 3,700 are in the West and being distributed, and back east they're going to start replacing all those Model 1865s around Washington, as they still want their home defense set up there first, and they will start arming from east and then moving back west again over the next year. However, they do feel that they have the hot spots covered with those 3,700 guns in the West. On July 3rd of 1867, J.R. Porter would arrive at Fort Phil Kearny on the Bozeman Trail, and with him he would bring 700 Model 1866 rifles. Presumably these were brought from Nebraska, and he would also bring 100,000 rounds of cartridges. Now, on July 23rd, Luther P. Bradley would show up to Fort C.F. Smith, also on the Bozeman Trail, with 2 companies of infantry, all armed with Model 1866 rifles and ammunition to go with them. Now, the thing was, the men, especially at Fort C.F. Smith, who did not receive their guns until July 23rd of 1867, they hadn't seen the Model 1865s, and in all reality, the Model 1866 was the first Springfield Trapdoor breech loader they would ever lay their eyes on. And they kind of began to grow accustomed to it. They needed to grow accustomed to it because 8 days later, on August the 1st of 1867, the Allen's Conversion Trapdoor Springfield No. 2 would be the first trapdoor to get a baptism of fire in what we call the hayfield fight. Now, once again, I have to say I'm not covering this in depth. Once again, go check out Tales of the Trails, either the live shows or the podcast, to find out a little bit more about the hayfield fight. On August 1st of 1867, a few miles from Fort C.F. Smith, at a place where the soldiers were cutting hay, there were 20 soldiers and 9 civilians involved. About 800 Indians began an attack. The soldiers would take refuge inside of a small wooden corral made of wagon boxes and lumber. The natives would attack 2 times early in the morning, and usually when the natives attacked, they would run in, feign an attack, wait for that 30 to 40 seconds when the soldiers would normally be reloading their guns, and in that time overrun the position and kill them. But these were infantry troops who were now armed with the new Trapdoor 1866 Allen conversion rifles. Also to be mentioned, there was 1 civilian with a shotgun, a couple of other civilians with Spencers, and some Henrys involved. And so, when the natives feigned the first attack and expected a reload, they suddenly realized there was no reload. The fire was consistent and hot and kept coming in. They tried 2 charges and both of them failed. After that, they attempted to set the grass on fire. Remember, this is a force of about 800 versus 29. And when they set the grass on fire, the soldiers obviously feared for their life, but a sudden wind change put the fire out. After that, it became sniper warfare, but the 50-70s far outranged the Indians' bows and even most of their muzzle loaders, forcing them to get back to a distance of 500 to 600 yards, which actually allowed the soldiers to get down to a small stream for water. The natives would regroup and not come back to fight until later on that afternoon. The natives tried again. This time they took aim at the army mules and got most of them. But by now the troops were well entrenched and had thrown up dirt works. The fighting would continue on and off with several other valiant stories and some not so valiant stories in there until about 8:30 that night when reinforcements would finally arrive from Fort C.F. Smith. By this point, most of the natives have given up. The reinforcements brought with them a howitzer, and with one shot, the rest of the natives scattered. Now the total death count here would be 3 soldiers killed and 4 wounded, and around 24 natives would be killed in this engagement. But the fighting for the 1866 in August of 1867 was not over yet, because the very next day the other half of Red Cloud's warriors would attack up at Fort Phil Kearny what was called the woodcutting detail. Now this is a very interesting story and well documented in history. The way this worked was the infantry, along with a handful of civilian woodcutters, would go out from the fort to an area to cut wood, and what they would do is they would take the wagon boxes off of the wagon running gears, and they would load the logs on the running gears and leave the wagon boxes in a small circle of about 100 foot by 100 foot. That would be their makeshift fortress. They also had scouts out on the hills. Now, right after Reveille that morning, and I'm not going to go once again into great detail, but right after Reveille that morning, a story I find very interesting is a certain Private John Garrett was set up on a hill. Now, Private John Garrett was known for being an excellent shot, and since he had grown up with muzzle loaders and round balls and not having, a whole lot of ability to adjust sightage and windage, he was very good at determining the range of a target. Now, John Garrett had never fired a model of 1866 before, but he had been drilled in its use. And he did know the ranges in the sights, and he did know how it operated. Now, after Reveille that morning, he looks out and sees something to the tune of 800 to 1,000 warriors coming down the side of the mountain upon what was going to be them. He sent off the warning to the guys to get in. Here they come. They're coming fast on horseback. He sits down and takes his 1866 and props it on a rock. He flips the backside up to the 700-yard sight and waits for the lead warrior to enter his firing range. And when that warrior does, with one shot at 700 yards, knocks down and instantly kills that warrior's horse out from under him. Now that warrior would get up and mount another horse, but they knew right then and there something's up, because this is more range than we have ever been taken before with a single shot from one of those Springfield muzzleloaders. 3 soldiers would be killed trying to get back down to Wagon Corral, Wagon Fortress, but in the end, 26 soldiers and 6 civilians would make it into the little corral of wagon boxes. Now, over the years, some people have said that the wagon boxes were steel lined. That's not true. There was no steel lining. They also did not have dirt in these wagon boxes. These guys were set upon so fast they had no time to dig in. They literally just had 1-inch pine boards. Now, those 1-inch pine boards in those wagon boxes could stop a native bow, but probably weren't too good at stopping those Lehman muzzle-loading rifles and other Northwest trade guns and what other muskets those Indians might have had at the time. After all 26 troops and 6 civilians were safely inside the wagon box corral, the only order that was really given to them was shoot to kill. The wagons were attacked by an estimated 800 to 1,000 warriors, and the soldiers did have over 7,000 rounds of 50-70, and instead of using their cartridge boxes laying in the prone as they were, since they were likely to spill, they simply turned their caps upside down and filled the caps as much as they could with 50-70 ammo right at their side. They would reach from the cap and throw that bullet right back into that gun. They would reach down from their cap after they ejected their cartridge and grab another one and slam it in there, and their rate of fire was unbelievable with this system. The natives were immediately taken back at the new rate of fire and pulled back to, once again, about 600 yards to regroup. If we've learned one thing from either the hayfield fight or the wagon box fight, it's that the natives tend to feel safe at around 600 yards. Obviously, not all of the troops there could shoot like Private John Garrett. So after the natives regrouped, they would come back with a mostly mounted charge. Troops inside the wagons noticed that the tents outside could be used for cover, and so the race was on, with all but one tent being torn down by the troops before the mounted charge could reach them. With the tents gone, the troops returned to the wagon box corral and began to pour an unbelievable amount of fire into the oncoming charge. The barrels of their rifles were so hot they could barely touch them, and once again this charge was stopped dead. Hours passed after that, with small skirmishes taking place, until a large group of warriors, hiding in a ravine to the northwest, suddenly made a very swift foot charge towards the soldiers. Instantly they were met with withering fire from the defenders. The natives had no idea what was going on. They should not be able to fire this fast, being infantry troops. The natives did get well within 200 feet of the corral, so that some of the soldiers claimed they could see the whites of their eyes, but the non-stop fire from Allen's guns was so much that the charge broke before it ever reached the wagons. The fighting did continue that day until reinforcements would arrive, and once again the boom of a loud mountain howitzer would send the natives into retreat. A new chapter of the Indian Wars had begun. No longer could the massive amounts of Native Americans just simply charge in on a fortified group of small soldiers and expect to beat the fortifications and defeat the soldiers to win the day. The soldiers, with these brand new rapid-firing 50-70 Trapdoor rifles that worked without fail to this point. There's no reports of any failures in either of these fights of the guns. No jams, no copper cartridges being jammed up in the guns, which, by the way, that was the same copper cartridges that Custer would use in 1876, a few years later. However, the difference was these were fresh copper cartridges that had never been in leather or that kind of belt storage. They were fresh brand new cartridges in fresh brand new guns, and they ran flawlessly. So, after the wagon box fight, the natives never really attacked infantry that were in any kind of fortifications again, and so, with this being an infantry long weapon, it never really got used that much after that point. It would be in service from 1867 until 1870. Erskine Allen and the Springfield Armory would make a grand total of 51,073 of these all in one piece. Now, at this point in time, the U.S. military had about 57,000 people in it, and so nearly armed the entire military with guns that in the end only cost $8.16 to make. So therefore, by the time they were done, we had spent around $416,000 to make all 51,070 some of these guns. This is generally when I would start talking about later civilian use. However, there's one little story here about a civilian who had one way before he should have. As a matter of fact, he got it before most military troops did. And his name was William F. Cody. Now, a lot of people know him as Buffalo Bill, and in the year of 1867, he was running around the prairie playing scout during Hancock's War. He would spend some time up at Fort Hays, Kansas, and then he would spend some more time down at Fort Larned, Kansas, and running back and forth between forts, delivering messages and scouting for natives at the time. Now, he had a model of 1866 full-bore, full-length gun that he called Lucretia Borgia. And it was really probably his favorite rifle that he owned in his entire life. It is on display at the Cody Firearms Museum. However, I noticed when I first looked it up, they didn't really have a good story about how he came by the gun. As a matter of fact, when I first looked it up at the time, they claimed that he got it during the Civil War. Obviously, we know that's not possible because these guns did not exist before January of 1867. And so, in the late summer, early fall of 1867, he's running around with one of these things. And there's several places he could have got it. It could have came from Fort Hays. It could have came from Fort Larned. It could have came from a couple of other places. But personally, I believe that it came from Fort Larned, Kansas, as there seems to be a story of him needing to ride and carry a message to Fort Dodge, Kansas, and him not having a long gun on him at the time. And so the fort armed him with a note and a gun, and when he got to Fort Dodge, he was to turn the gun and the note in and get a muzzleloader or some older gun to come back, because the only gun that they had to give him was a new model of 1866. And evidently, the story goes, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who knows better than me, but as far as I understand it, the note wound up in Fort Dodge, and the 1866 kept going with William F. Cody for the rest of his life, and he never turned it in. And he really was working as a scout, but he was a civilian and not actually a part of the Army. And he would go to work for the Kansas Pacific Railroad in the winter of 1867 and all the way through to 1868, where his job was to kill buffalo. He supposedly, in 1 year's time, managed to amass a kill of over 4,200 buffalo, all with Lucretia Borgia. And he did it very quickly and very cleanly, and most of those shots were noted to be done one shot, one kill with the big, heavy, powerful 50-70 cartridge. Now, the interesting thing is he would have literally been the only civilian running around the Kansas prairies at that time with a full-bore 1866 50-70 military musket, and he used it to great effect. Now, the thing was, at Fort Wallace, Kansas, there was a man named Bill Comstock, known as Billy Comstock. And people were starting to call William F. Cody Buffalo Bill for the amount of buffalo that he had killed. Now, Billy Comstock's guys said, you can't call him Buffalo Bill because we got a guy who can kill just as many buffalo. And supposedly, they set up a buffalo hunt contest. And this would have happened around Sheridan, Kansas. Now, supposedly, there were referees there to follow each of the hunters who would be hunting on horseback with rifles, and there were supposedly women and people that came out for a picnic and gentlemen, and the only real issue is there's not a whole lot of evidence that this hunt ever took place outside of Bill Cody's account of it and his sister's account of it, and maybe a couple of other people, but even their accounts differ. So we don't have 100% proof that this hunt took place, but it seems logical. Let's hear about this hunt in Bill's own words. So these are the words of William F. Cody regarding the hunt itself. He said, I had my celebrated buffalo hunt with Billy Comstock, a noted scout, guide, and interpreter, who was then chief of scouts at Fort Wallace, Kansas. Comstock had the reputation for a long time of being the most successful buffalo hunter. The officers in particular who had seen him kill buffalo were very desirous of backing him in a match against me. It was accordingly arranged that I should shoot against him in a buffalo killing match, and the preliminaries were easily and satisfactorily agreed to. We were to hunt one day of 8 hours, beginning at 8 o'clock in the morning and closing at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The wager was $500 a side, and the man who would kill the most buffalo, the greater number, from horseback, went on to be declared the winner. Billy Comstock used an 1860 Henry rifle chambered in .44 Henry, far less powerful than this gun, but with a higher rate of fire. And of course, old Bill, Buffalo Bill, or as we know him, William F. Cody, took his Lucretia Borgia 50-70 rifle and went out and killed 68 buffalo that day to Comstock's 46. And the story was that Comstock would ride into the buffalo and fire 3 or 4 shots per buffalo per kill, whereas William F. Cody would ride into the herd and kill 1 buffalo with 1 shot from the 50-70, and was proved to be the better hunter that day, supposedly. But this is not the only story of Bill Cody and Lucretia Borgia, his 1866 rifle. One story Cody told of one poor man on his way to Colorado who lost a horse to a passing cattle herd. The trail boss wouldn't return it. He asked Buffalo Bill for help, but there was some confusion about whether Cody was a constable with authority to seek the horse's return. Cody wrote, I buckled on my revolver and took down old Lucretia, and patting her gently said, you will be the constable for me today. In 1917, Western author Zane Grey added an epilogue of sorts to The Last of the Great Scouts by Helen Cody Wetmore, Buffalo Bill's sister. Grey recounts a recollection of Cody's last days that he received from Buffalo Jones, one of Cody's longtime friends. Jones asked Cody, which gun was your favorite? Lucretia Borgia, he smiled. Did you always like the same gun? Jones asked. Practically so. The barrel of Lucretia Borgia is now on the elk horns at the ranch, you know, with the knife which I used to kill Yellowhand. I don't know where the stock is. And with that, Bill hung his white head wearily. Many stories abound about how the stock of this gun was broken. One story is that hunting with the Grand Duke Alexis, Bill handed the Duke the rifle to kill a buffalo, and after an instant kill, the Duke was so excited he threw the rifle in the air, spooking the horses. When it came down, a bucking horse stepped on it. The other story is that Bill was hunting elk and broke the stock on its head when he assumed the elk was not quite dead yet. Now, we do need to talk about short rifles, and I'm very, very cautious to talk about short rifles because when you do, everybody automatically assumes that the gun they have that was cut off by Bannerman or Sears or someone else is a short rifle. 1,146 guns with expanded barrel ends from a failed melding of the tube and the liner did come into the Springfield Armory and did have their barrels cut down to 36 inches. But just remember, if you're looking for a short rifle, anything that is done by Springfield will not be shoddy work. Everything will be moved into place. You won't see barrels hanging out, half a barrel band here, this here, extra long barrel there. That's not how they do it. Also, 426 cadet rifles were made. So the 1866 would definitely serve the United States military from 1867 until 1870. And by 1869, the new model, the 1868, was already in production. However, these, of course, would hang around until production of the 1868 caught up. Something very interesting happened in 1870, though. As the Franco-Prussian War was roaring overseas and the United States had vowed to stay neutral, some people in the Ordnance Department got to thinking about this thing, and along with some Remington rolling blocks that they were making in the 1870s, I call them the Springfield rolling blocks, the model of 1870 and 1871, and a few other rifles and about 500,000 muzzle loaders, they decided we can't sell guns to France, although we would like to support France. So through a Colonel Crispin, they sold over 28,000 of these Trapdoor rifles, model of 1866, through Colonel Crispin to Remington, who bought them and in turn sold them to the French. And that was how they got away with it. And they made quite a handsome sum off of this sell. As you'll recall, they built these guns for $8.16 and sold them for $21. Yeah. Tell me again that the Trapdoor rifle experiment isn't successful. Not only did we make them and use them almost up in our military service, but we also sold them for over twice, almost 3 times what they cost to build. And so for the first time, along with several of the other guns that they sold, the Ordnance Department had a surplus of money, and that helped them move on into other models. So what happened to these models that went to France? Well, they were brought in and refurbished before they went, which means that although they still have sharp edges, they could have sanded the cartouche to where you can't see it anymore. That's a theory. It's not been proven. They were refurbished. Everything still has sharp edges. Everything's still in the shape it should be. And they were sent off to France. However, there's no records of them being in combat. And it would appear to me that from the date that they sent and the date that they got there, they missed the conflict entirely, which meant they wound up in the hands of the Prussians. What did the Prussians do with all those chassepôts, trapdoors, rolling blocks, everything they captured? They sold them around the world as surplus. And a young man named Bannerman in the United States and a few other companies, Schuler, Hartley, and Graham, slowly began to pick these rifles back up and bring them back to the United States after they had been shipped all over the world. Remember, only 51,000 of these made, 28,000 overseas, and are starting to come back in the early 1870s. So what happens is nobody in the United States really wants to buy this long 3-band rifle. They prefer something a little shorter. Enter the Bannerman cut-off rifles. We're pretty well done talking about these 3 bands. Now let's talk about the civilian models, the models that most people in the 1870s and 80s were running around with who had one of these. Enter the Bannerman cut-down model. Now this is my particular rifle. It's one of my favorite rifles of all time. And people might say, well, it's a Bannerman butchered up rifle. Why would you want it? A lot of people part these things out and never even use them. But they have their own story. There was a good chance it was used in the Indian Wars. There's a good chance it was sent overseas. There's a good chance it could have went anywhere from South America to the Middle East in foreign sales and then brought back into America by Bannerman or another company. And when they brought them back in, they couldn't sell them. Nobody wanted that full-length Civil War musket. And remember, this is a time of westward expansion. These guns, if you have a 40-inch barrel gun and you're taking your whole life in a wagon that's 4 foot wide by 2 foot tall, you know, and 10 foot long, a few inches of barrel might be the difference of whether you take that gun to your new home with you or not. And so people wanted a shorter, handier gun, and Bannerman supplied the need. Now sometimes they're really well done, sometimes they're like this. This is the most common. If you have a gun like this is not Springfield work, I promise you. If you look at the barrel band, it has not been moved forward or back, it's just left there. That's the middle barrel band, and they just cut everything off and move the nose cap back. This one also, as we've talked before, has a broken spring in it, so it doesn't work the way that the military guns would work. When I open this, I have to pluck the cartridge out by hand. It brings it back just far enough that I can. Now these guns, these sporterized guns, would go all over the country, and George Armstrong Custer had one in the late 1860s, early 1870s. That was obviously one that stayed around here. But as these begin to come back in and they were shortened like this, they begin to flood the market. And in 1872, that's the last time we really see the model of 1866 in the Springfield Armory as far as being recorded. It seems they would go off and be sold to surplus by the end of 1872, all of them. That would include all the ones that went overseas. So now, as they're coming back, we have close to 50,000 back in the United States by the end of 1874, and these become a very, very popular gun for the buffalo hunts. And they would be used all over the country, not only buffalo, but elk, deer, anything. This gun came back into the country and cut down could be sold very cheaply, sometimes at a price of $2. So tell me, you can spend $40 on a Sharps or $2 or $3 on one of these used muskets that's been altered and cut down. Both guns will basically do the same thing unless you're talking extreme ranges. Okay everybody, pardon the wind. Only day we got to shoot, so we're gonna do it. I have the Bannerman cut down. This is a gun that is just over 31 inches long, and it's missing the rear plate screw. It's all right, still works. No spring in it because it's been broken in the past, so there is no ejector spring. As you'll recall in the manual, we discussed that the ejector spring was considered a luxury and not a necessity. So without further ado, let's take the little sanded down handy Everman's buffalo rifle here. There's no real manual of arms when you're a civilian. So, just pop a cartridge in. We're going to go for that little plate over there. It's only about 35 yards. But we can knock her down. Alright, like I said, no ejector spring. So what happens? Well, you just kind of pluck them out like it's a Remington rolling block is what happens. Alright, I like shooting close range because I can't shoot long range. So anyway, let's go over here about 25 yards and put one on Ghost Cowboy Bob. Just see how hard we hit him with this thing. That is a really hard hitting gun. I will say this civilian gun was sanded down so thin in the wrist and so much lighter does have more recoil than the long gun. Pluck your cartridge out. Remember, that's a luxury, not a necessity. All right, let's put one more round here over on the square plate. We went right through the square plate. I don't think we've done that one before. So yeah, that's pretty good. So the real question is, I have just a couple rounds left here before I'm going to let Duke handle this gun. Can you run this thing with any speed, which obviously is going to be a lot slower, without that spring? I have 3 cartridges in my hand and we are going to stay at close range. Yeah, we'll do 2 and then I'll put 1 at long range just so we can see how the gun hits. So, what we're going to do, left-handed, so this is not military in any way. Like I said, the gun is not military itself, so let's go ahead and load one. We are on the half-cock position. We're going to put these between our fingers just like we've done in some other videos. Let's see how fast a lefty can run this gun. You can dump it out there. And they do fall out, so yes, that spring is actually just a luxury and not a necessity.
Pilgrim, you've got to cock it.
The boys seem to think that one went way high, so what we're going to do is we're going to go down to our 100-yarder and I'm just going to hold on his head and see what happens. Try one more shot.
That's what happened. To pack one of these things around the prairie in 1874. I'd probably rather carry this one than that long one.
All right, so we got Garrett's little cut down. Too long to be a carbine, but too short to be a rifle. But you know what? I think it'll still kill that target out there anyway. Let's give her a try.
Get him in the right shoulder.
After 15 years of shooting black powder, I finally learned to keep my mouth shut when the wind's blowing in your face.
I was gonna say it's not a Duke video until he coughed from black powder smoke.
I pulled that one too. I knew it was to the left. I'm consistently hitting low. All right, so Garrett wants me to take the last 3 shots we got today, see how fast I can run them. So let's see what we can get done. Got one in there, doing a finger, she's on full cock. I'm about to drop the gun.
I think you got it figured out. Would you say that spring's a luxury?
Yeah, it works just fine without spring. The problem is that barrel is hot. I don't know. Both of them shoot pretty good. I hit 1 shot out of all the ones that took it long range with both of them. But that little shorter does make it a little lighter, especially if you're traveling on horseback. So I'd say either one would be a good choice back in the day.
Did you notice any felt recoil difference between this and the big one?
This one just negligible.
Yeah.
A little slight, little bit more recoil, but not that much.
So,
you had a fight for 2 weeks till your shoulder's broken?
No, not quite that bad.
but anyway, I find this one just for maneuverability. If you're got your whole life in a 10-foot long by 4-foot wide wagon,
Yeah.
I would probably go with one of these just for the compactness of it.
Yep.
But
It'll kill a buffalo at 300 yards just as good as the long one.
all right, everybody, thank you for watching this video. This is Duke Frazier, Duke Frazier Productions. Do not forget to go check that out. The link will be in the description. Trust in God. Keep your powder dry. Bye.
And we'll see you on down the trail.
All right, we're good.